Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to a live edition of Adam's Music Box, which means that things look different. I don't get my nice background. And it looks like I'm on some sort of sinking submarine about to go down into the Titanic. But who knows? Who cares? Because today we're going to talk about musical comedy, because a legend of musical comedy who was a household name for decades just died very recently. And this is, of course, Martin Mull. Now, Martin Mull was a very, very good guitar player, and he didn't limit himself to just the guitar. There was obviously mandolins and other stringed instruments of the six-legged variety, but he was really known for sitting back in a chair, much nicer one than this, and doing his thing. He had that classic sort of deadpan, was wonderful at retorting to people in the comments who in the comments. We're not talking about YouTube, in the audience who would heckle him during the show. And he was someone who was ubiquitous on things like Fernwood Tonight and other television shows. He was even in one of the best cult films of the late 70s, which was a relatively realistic look at what it was like running an FM radio station. This was, of course, the film called FM. Steely Dan did the main title song for that film, and the film had a great soundtrack to accompany it, full stop. And remembering Martin Mull and thinking about him got me thinking about the relationship between comedy and music, because there are a lot of points of contact. There is music that can sound funny, there are lyrics that are meant to make you laugh, and there are comedians who have gone into music, or in some cases, they know a lot about music from day one because they're either trained as musicians, because they've split their time between comedy and music, or any of these combinations. One of my very favorite comedians of all time, the great stand-up Sam Kinison, was a relatively accomplished guitarist. He could hold his own, and he had a voice that was sort of made for heavy metal even before heavy metal. You may not know this, but he started out as a preacher, I believe, in the Pentecostal tradition, and you can sort of tell, you can reverse engineer that voice, and you can hear him in that kind of church preaching. And that's exactly his background. That's exactly where he came from. And whether he's covering things like Wild Thing, or whether he's playing, there was a great J.J. Cale song that he did, and the name will come to me any minute now. The wonderful Scottish band Stone the Crows did a cover of it. The name will come to me. Don't worry, possibly when the stream is over. But oh, here we go. I'm Going Down. Great J.J. Cale song. Many people have done it, but I think one of the best versions is actually the one that Sam did. And then we have people like Spike Jones, very, very musical. And the band even referenced him in Up on Cripple Creek about the man's wife who couldn't stand the way he sang, but she loved to hear him talk. Then, of course, you've got Bill Cosby, who was a producer and kind of arranger for many, many interesting albums, both of the instrumental variety and of the vocal variety. The stuff that he came out with was some very interesting and progressive jazz music. And he also oversaw the production of a lot of other music that people would either write in collaboration with him or write under the sort of tutelage of his companies. The Fat Albert stuff was really good. And there's actually a rare gem in my collection from 1980. It's Fat Albert and the Junkyard Band, Rock and Roll Disco. Cosby didn't write the music or the arrangements for that, but obviously Fat Albert was part of the wider family of Bill Cosby's creations. Then you've got people like Lenny Bruce, who was a bit of a drummer, and Johnny Carson, who loved playing the drums. A lot of people said that Carson wasn't a particularly friendly or amiable person behind the scenes, but when he was playing his drums, he was apparently in heaven. And he never really played them much in public, but there was a 60-minute show that he did. I think it was 60 minutes anyway. This was in the 80s, and they went over to his house in Malibu, and he played a bit of drums, and you could see his setup. He got his nice amplifiers behind him. He put on his headphones, and he did what other people who weren't as famous or as wealthy by that time did. There was Steve Martin, who did a lot of comedy music as a vocalist. And then there are examples of comedians who transitioned into mainstream pop music. People like Eddie Murphy. Anyone remember the song Party All the Time? Well, that's an example of someone who was a very edgy comedian who then also dabbled in and had quite a lot of success in mainstream, straightforward, non comedic pop music. There are other examples. This one is less known internationally, but in the UK, there's the comedian Bill Bailey, and his whole career has really been musical comedy. If you haven't heard of him, you should go to YouTube and check out some of the stuff he does. As his setups became more elaborate over the years, and he did more and more, you can see that he got incredibly more sophisticated with the kind of arrangements. He's even done stuff with orchestras, again, sort of harkening back to the sort of Spike Jones type of things. One of my favorite comedians of all time, who had tremendous international acclaim from China to Cancun and everywhere in between, is, of course, the late, great Benny Hill. Now, his music is memorable for his poetic lyrics. Sometimes he would parody well known songs, sometimes he would just come up with sort of little ditties of his own in that traditional music hall or vaudevillian style. And he was a great poet. His sense of wordplay, his sense of timing, his sense of innuendo was absolutely peerless. At the time, Benny Hill was popular all around the world, including in countries like Albania, with very little access to media outside of itself. He was popular, as I said, in Asia, South America, North America, all over Europe. And at times, some people have criticized him for being old fashioned, but I think most people now are coming back round to the fact that he really was a not only a comedic genius, but a musical genius. Really, really a special guy. And Michael Jackson was a huge fan of Benny Hill. And in the months before he died, he actually met with Michael Jackson in London, and there was talk of the two of them collaborating. Sadly, he died shortly thereafter, and it never came to be. But there are some photographs I've seen of them together, and Michael was a huge, huge fan of Benny Hill. Because we're doing this live, I just need to check and see if everything is working. It appears to be. I'm sure I'll find out sooner or later. So yeah, let me see if we can think of some other interesting musicians and comedians that sort of met. You can look at the Rat Pack, because even though the guys in that Rat Pack, with the exception of Joey Bishop, were best known for their singing, Frank Sinatra, and particularly Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. as well, were very funny. That's why Dean Martin hosted his own show, a very good show, I might add. And it's why, as actors, they all were capable of being very funny. Again, they came from a tradition where even if you're well known and sort of putting yourself out there, firstly and foremost as a singer, you had to also act, you had to compare, meaning host, MC things. And implicit in that is you kind of had to be funny. You had to have a bit of comic timing. You needed to be able to recite a joke every now and then. So there's that. And comedy and music have always sort of been lumped together, because they've always been the kinds of things that, until the age of commercialization of comedy and music, they were things that were sort of looked down upon. Music, of course, had its beginnings in the Western tradition. It's different in other parts of the world, but in the Western tradition, it began as something that was liturgical, which is the antithesis of something that you would commercialize. I know everything is commercialized today, but the idea of commercializing something spiritual was frowned upon in many societies, and it still is in many quarters. And then that eventually transitioned to chamber music, and that literally was named because it would be played in the chamber of a stately home owned by an aristocrat. Now, all the while, we had folk music, music played by people to entertain themselves and those in close proximity to them, at village taverns and saloons and the rest of it, and people playing at home for themselves. And folk music was something that, again, the antithesis of commercialism, because it was people entertaining themselves. Folk music obviously inspired a lot of the music that would later become commercialized. But at the time, and we're talking about well before the 19th century, going back all the way to the Middle Ages or before, because folk music is something that's always existed in one form or another. It was, of course, a non commercial endeavor then. Music beyond folk music, so what we would consider Western classical music, that really came to be commercialized in the 19th century. And this was because concert halls were growing and the orchestras that you were putting in them were growing so as to fill them with sound. And we see this transition from orchestral music in the Western classical tradition going from the church and the chamber into the larger and larger concert halls. And of course, as concert halls and opera houses become larger and larger, the commercialism that's implicit to that becomes all the more prominent. More tickets sold, and obviously, as the productions become of higher value in opera, and as you have more musicians on stage in orchestral, symphonic performances, you're going to need to increase the ticket prices. Everything, of course, became huge in the 20th century because you had the advent of radio and recorded sound. This made it easier not only to democratize music, something which we'd see as egalitarian or even radical, and at the same time, this also allowed for music to become more readily commercialized, something that some might see as anti egalitarian. But both of these things were happening simultaneously in the 20th century. And so while music was always considered prior to the 19th century as something that was either sacred or profane, so you had the music in church that was sacred and the music everywhere else that was profane, then beginning in the 19th century, we see that you can commercialize it. And all of a sudden, that which was profane, secular music, is now becoming respectable because sadly, we live in a society where if you can't attach something commercial to it, people tend to think of it generally as profane unless it has a specific spiritual connotation. And comedy followed a similar but even slower trajectory to respectability than music. While people like Wagner gave music respectability by commercializing it and democratizing it in the 19th century, a trend that would inspire the people who first recorded and broadcast music in the 20th century, comedy had its traditions in folkishness. People have an urge to make other people laugh. It's simply part of human nature. Just as love is a natural part of human desire and human nature, and just as hatred is a human emotion that is inevitable, so too is laughter. And all comedy is the intentional instigation of laughter. Sometimes we laugh at things unintentionally. We see something funny, something looks funny, something smells funny, something sounds funny. But comedy, in and of itself, when it's a trade or when it's a talent, is something that we do because we're trying to instigate, we're trying to inspire laughter. And this resulted in things like the court jester, that would be the analog to the chamber musician. They took place in similar places, but we see other forms of comedy, the commedia dell'arte. We see great playwrights who wrote commercially, who wrote comedically, but the idea of the single individual delighting people and this being respectable was still quite a ways off. This really began in the tradition of the music hall or vaudeville, which are relatively interchangeable cultural phenomenon. In Europe, it tends to be referred to more as music hall, and in North America, it tends to be referred to more as vaudeville. And that's where we see the origins of the modern stand-up comedian. And because vaudeville was very, very musical as well, you see the phenomenon of people who were able to, and in many cases had to, make people enjoy the music and make people laugh. Look at the Marx Brothers. There's a musical element, Harpo Marx, and there's a physical element, the slapstick comedy of, people like Hepper. And then there's people who were the witty, the oral comedy, the verbal comedy of Groucho. So they, between the brothers, they had it all. They had the verbal, they had the physical, and they had the musical. And then as we get further and further into the 20th century, we see this idea of the stand up comedian becoming more and more solidified. And the place where these people tended to appear first were in places that needed entertainment before the main act. And what were these places? They were either music clubs or strip clubs. So between acts, when one band was taking down their equipment and the other was coming up, or breaks in musical sets, you would have a comedian. And that's how Jay Leno got started. Jay Leno, well, he got started before that in the strip clubs because, while you're waiting between the strippers, and in the era before DJs, you'd have a comedian to keep people in their seats between the striptease. And then people like Jay, and he was relatively typical of that time and place, moved on to the music scene. And Jay Leno can say, and he has said, that he's played along with Herbie Hancock and Miles Davis, not on a musical instrument, but being the comic interlude between the musical sets at these late night jazz clubs on the East Coast where he grew up. And so what this continued throughout the 70s, but television made comedy all the more prominent because comedy on television served a similar purpose that it did in the clubs. Between, let's say we're back in the 60s now with Ed Sullivan, and he'd have a musical act, he might have a dancing act, and he'd have comedy to break things up, the sort of palate cleanser, if you will. And on shows in the 70s, like the Midnight Special, you had comedy on all of the late night shows. You had specific shows that were dedicated to sketch comedy, Monty Python being one of the biggest in the UK, Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In being one of the biggest in the US. But the true golden age of the stand-up comedian was sort of the late 70s and the early 80s, because people got the idea that you could build clubs where the comedy wasn't one of many forms of entertainment and wasn't some sort of interlude, but it was the main attraction. And so you see places popping up all over, mainly North America, but eventually it went global. But it was this stand up comedy boom where every town had an improv just about, and comedy stores were popping up. Obviously, the original one paved the way for all of this, the original on Sunset Boulevard in West Hollywood in LA. But this was when comedy really popped up. And one of the things that inspired this was something that happened to television around this time, and this was HBO. HBO launched in the late 70s on this newfangled cable television, and they needed something cheap and cheerful, literally, to put on between their other more expensive content. And what's cheaper than comedy? Which is why comedy again was used in these music clubs and strip clubs and on television between the other acts, because stand-up comedy doesn't require any costumes most of the time or staging. It's just one person and a microphone, and if they have a guitar or piano, that's easy because a guitar is handheld. And all of these clubs generally, and certainly all of the TV studios, would have had a piano to accommodate the musical tendencies of comedians. So we can see how there are some differences, but many more prominent similarities between comedy and music. And this helps to explain why a lot of comedians double as musicians, why a lot of musicians double as comedians. And then you get to people who never considered themselves comedians, but made interesting musical, lyrical observations in a comedic way. Frank Zappa comes to mind, an incredibly serious musician, but someone whose lyrics are full of comical observations. And Frank Zappa never set out to make people laugh, but nor did he set out to make people do the opposite. There's a very famous interview that MTV didn't air in the early 80s, but it's now on YouTube, where he was talking to the interviewer, and she starts laughing at a remark he made because she was asking him about the dispute he had with John Lennon, which we've talked about on this channel before. And she asked if he was going to take legal action. And Zappa replied, "Not yet." And she just burst out laughing. And she felt kind of embarrassed about it. But he said, well, what's wrong with laughing? Do you really expect yourselves and others to take this seriously? Give yourself and others a break. I'm screwing it up a bit, but that's basically what he said. And Zappa was someone who sort of appealed to people who liked music that was intentionally comedic, and at the same time was someone who was attractive to those who wanted serious music but with a comic angle. And that's why his music was popular on the Dr. Demento radio show, because that radio show featured what they called at the time novelty records, which basically meant the weird, the comedic, the funny, the outlandish. And a lot of it was stuff that wasn't particularly highbrow or clever comedy. There were songs about, car crashes, and songs about killing puppies, and there was weird stuff and just absurd stuff. There was that fish song, not the band that spells its name with a P, but a song about fish. I forget, but there are lots of Spotify playlists you can go and locate some of the more well known novelty or comic songs that were on Dr. Demento. And this inspired, of course, someone who's probably the best known musical parodist in the world, and this was Weird Al. He was someone who grew up listening to the Dr. Demento radio show, and he said, well, I can do that. I can make funny music. And the route that he chose to go down was parodying existing songs. One of his first to get airplay on the Dr. Demento show was Another One Rides the Bus, which is a rather PG or frankly G rated parody of the Queen's song Another One Bites the Dust. And you had things like My Bologna, My Sharona, and it went from there. Um, and so again, you see this level of connectivity between music and comedy, and Martin Mull was certainly a huge part of getting people not just to accept, but to really, really embrace this inevitability of music and comedy coming together and entertaining many of the same audiences. So this is the first time I've tried doing this live on YouTube. I kind of miss my background, but I'll do this maybe once in a while, depending on if people like it. And of course, if you do like this channel, make sure to subscribe. Don't just phone a friend, but tell a friend. And if you want, you can even donate on that little Ko-Fi link, which is in the description, hopefully of this video, but certainly of all of the others. And as this builds, hopefully I'll even be able to interact with a few of you humanoids in the chat as we take this small and young channel and get it to be old and wise, but hopefully not as old and wise as some people who may or may not have been on a debate stage in recent days. But that is another story, another story for another day. Musical connections there, who knows? Maybe we'll be able to locate those. So we'll be back tomorrow. Rest in peace, Martin Mull. Keep listening to his fun-filled music and that of other musicians who made you laugh and other comedians who made you sing. Take care.